What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You have met that line 100 times, printed under a photograph of someone lifting something heavy, or said aloud by anyone trying to make pain sound like a gift. The line is Friedrich Nietzsche's Nietzsche, and the bitter joke of his life is that almost nothing in it made him stronger. He was going blind by slow degrees. Headaches sealed him into darkened rooms for days at a time, sick and unable to read a single line, and he spent his best hours walking alone in the thin mountain air because the pain would not let him sit still. The strongest man in the history of self-help slogans could barely see the path under his own feet. And while his body was quietly failing him, he was setting down some of the most dangerous sentences anyone has ever written. Sentences so easy to bend that the bending began almost at once and has never really stopped. The coffee mug is the smallest theft. The largest came later. After his mind collapsed and he could no longer answer for himself, his own sister rewrote him into a prophet for the cruelest regime of the century to come, trimmed his notebooks to fit it, and pressed his walking stick into the hands of Adolf Hitler. The same man turned into a coffee mug slogan at one end and a Nazi saint at the other. A single set of words rung inside out until they said the opposite of what they were meant to say. Underneath all that misreading, there was a warning, and it is the warning we still have not managed to hear. He looked at the confident, comfortable world of the late 1800s and saw something almost nobody else could see, that the ground beneath all of it had begun to rot. God is dead, he wrote, 3 of the most misquoted words in any language. He did not write them to gloat. He wrote them the way a doctor says the word terminal, because he believed the faith that had held Europe together for 1,000 years had quietly stopped being believable, and that no one yet grasped what falls apart when it goes. The finding out, he thought, would take the next 200 years. He may have been right. He spoke of himself as a fuse already lit. "I am no man," he wrote. "I am dynamite." And he predicted, without ever raising his voice, that his name would one day be fastened to something monstrous. He was right about that too. Almost no one read him while he lived. He paid out of a thin university pension to print his own books, and one of the works we now call a masterpiece went into the world in an edition of 40 copies, handed to friends who could not make sense of it. So here is a man worth keeping company with tonight, half-blind, unread, soon to lose his mind altogether, and somehow seeing further than the whole crowded century around him. What do you do when the thing that gave your life its shape turns out to be gone? What comes rushing into the space it leaves behind? And could you love your own life, the dull stretches and the worst of it, every last moment, enough to want it all back again, exactly the same, without end? Those were his questions. Tonight belongs to them, and to everything else this strange, lonely, electric mind actually worked out, including the one place near the very end where it broke. There is nothing here you need to grip. The questions that sit on your chest like a weight in daylight tend to go soft in the dark, where nothing has to be settled and there is nowhere you are meant to be. So let the day fall away. Let yourself grow heavier than you usually allow. There is a long, slow night ahead and no hurry anywhere inside it. The kind of company that asks nothing of you except that you stay a while or drift off partway through. Either is fine. Both always were. If something like this seems worth making, following along is the quietest way to keep it alive, and the replies to one small question always get read. Is there a line you have repeated for years without once asking who first said it or what they were truly trying to tell you? Sit with that, or let it dissolve into the dark. Either way, the place to begin is where he began, in a quiet country parsonage full of grieving women, where a 4-year-old boy stood at the edge of his father's deathbed and watched the first of his certainties slip silently away. The illness took most of a year to do its work. Through the autumn and winter of 1848, the village pastor of Recurrence, a gentle music-loving man named Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, began to complain of headaches, then of a heaviness behind his eyes, then of a confusion he could not find his way out of. The doctors who came to the parsonage called it a softening of the brain, which is the sort of phrase that sounds like a diagnosis and explains nothing whatsoever. No one then could say what was eating through him, and no one since has managed to say for certain either. He died in the summer of 1849, 35 years old, and his small son stood near enough to carry the memory for the rest of his life. 4 decades on, the same unaccountable darkness would settle over that son's mind, and the doctors of his own day would prove no better at naming it. But no one in the grieving house could have known that, and the boy at the bedside knew only that his father was gone. He was not yet 5. He had come into the world looking, at the time, like a small piece of good fortune. Born on the 15th of October, 1844, a date that happened to be the birthday of the reigning Prussian king, who was also his father's patron. They named the child Friedrich Wilhelm after the king, and the future seemed stitched neatly into place. A pastor's son in a long line of pastors, born under a royal star, destined for the church like his father and his father's father before him. Then, before he had even learned to read, the whole tidy arrangement came undone in a sick room. It came undone twice. A few months after they lowered the father into the ground, the youngest child of the house, a baby brother not yet 2, died as well. The boy claimed afterward that he had dreamed it the night before it happened. The church organ sounding, a small grave opening in the earth beside the larger one. 2 coffins in a single winter. Whatever a child of 4 can understand about death, he was given a thorough and early education in it. What remained of the family left Recurrence for the town of Naumburg, and folded itself around him. It was a household made entirely of women. His young mother, Franziska, barely past 20 and already a widow, his little sister, Elizabeth, a grandmother, 2 unmarried aunts, and in the middle of them all, one small, solemn boy, the only male left under the roof. He took the whole inheritance seriously. He learned scripture by heart and recited it until the village children teased him for it. He is said to have wept at the sound of certain hymns. He kept the Sabbath so faithfully that his own family nicknamed him, half fondly, the little pastor. He was being shaped with great love to step into the empty place his father had left, to grow into the man of God the house had lost. The one warm thing that survived from the father was not faith, but music. Karl Ludwig had been known for sitting at the piano and improvising for hours, and the son took to the keyboard early and never let it go. For the rest of his life, when words failed him and belief failed him, music stayed the one place where something like the old holiness still seemed to live. It was, in a way, the first sign of how this mind would always work, reaching for some means of keeping the sacred feeling even after the sacred thing itself had gone. At 14, he was sent away to be finished properly to a school called Schulpforta, an old monastery turned boarding school, 6 centuries of grey stone and iron routine, and the finest classical education the German lands could offer. The days began before first light and ran on Latin and Greek. And here, bent over the ancient languages he turned out to be quietly brilliant at, something began to shift in him that no one, least of all the boy himself, would yet have thought to call dangerous. The trouble was that the same patient, exacting attention he had been taught to bring to the Bible, he now found himself bringing to Homer and Sophocles, to a whole world of Greek gods and tragic heroes and merciless fate that was far older than Christianity and serenely indifferent to it. He began to read the Holy Book the way a scholar reads any ancient document, studying its sources, the seams where different hands had stitched it together across the centuries. And a question started to take shape, the kind that will not leave once it has arrived. If you examine the Gospels with exactly the same cool, curious eye you bring to every other old text, what becomes of the part of them that is supposed to be holy? The answer arrived without any drama at all. There was no crisis, no slammed door. His faith simply began to thin, the way a morning fog thins, until one spring, he was 20, home from his university studies. He quietly declined to take communion and sat down to write his devout, frightened sister a letter trying to explain. "The roads of life divide here," he told her, more or less. "If what you want is peace of mind and contentment, then believe. But if you want to be a servant of the truth, then you have no choice but to inquire." He had already chosen which road was his. He had not reasoned his way out of God so much as woken one ordinary morning to find the belief was no longer in him, the way you wake to find a long fever has broken in the night. The most solid thing in his world had quietly, almost gently, ceased to be there. And here is the part the bumper sticker version of this man always misses. Losing God was no liberation for him, or not only that. Remember who this was. A pastor's son, raised more deeply inside the faith than almost any philosopher who ever lived. A child who had already felt the floor of the world give way once in a sick room. For someone built the way he was built, losing God was that same floor dropping a second time. When the famous words finally came, years later, "God is dead," there was no triumph anywhere in them. They read far more like a death notice than a boast. He understood better than any cheerful unbeliever ever could what those 3 words were going to cost, because the cost had already been taken out of him. There is something stranger still here, stranger than the atheism, and it almost never gets said aloud. He stopped believing in God, but he never once stopped being religious. The temperament stayed intact, the bone-deep seriousness, and the conviction, pure pastor's son, that how a person lives is finally a matter of something close to salvation, even with heaven taken out of the picture. He would spend his remaining years as a kind of priest with no altar and no God, working at a single problem with everything he had. What could possibly stand where God had stood, now that the place was empty? The whole of his philosophy grows out of that one vacancy at the heart of a devout childhood. Everything he would ever think begins here, with a boy who lost his father and then lost his father in heaven and was left both times holding the very same question. When the thing that held your whole world together is simply gone, what holds? You may know some smaller version of that question yourself. Most people carry one. There tends to be something you were sure of as a child, about how the world worked, or about who would always be there for you, that quietly stopped being true somewhere along the line. Not through any single argument or blow, just through the slow fact of living. The ground rarely cracks open in front of you. More often you simply notice, one unremarkable day, that it is no longer under your feet, that it has not been for some time, and that you have gone on walking anyway. You do not have to do a thing with that tonight. The thought can lie in the dark beside you, perfectly harmless, while the room stays exactly as it is. The same ceiling overhead, the same late hour drifting quietly past. Nothing here has to be settled before morning. The question of what holds when the old supports fall away has waited an extraordinarily long time already, and it will keep just as well while you rest. As for the young man left holding it, he did not stay still inside that emptiness for long. He went looking for something to set in the space where his faith had been. And before many more years had passed, on a shelf in the back of a shop he had wandered into almost by accident. He was about to come upon a book that seemed to have been written from inside the very same darkness by a man who had looked straight into it without flinching and had given it a name. He always told the story afterward as if something outside him had reached in and made the choice. He had wandered into a second-hand bookshop with no particular purpose, and his hand came to rest on a thick, unfashionable volume by a writer almost nobody was reading anymore. "I don't know what demon whispered to me," he wrote later, "take this book home." He took it home. He threw himself into a corner of the sofa and began to read, and for the next 2 weeks he barely slept. The book was The World as Will and Representation, and its author, Arthur Schopenhauer, had been dead for 5 years. What the young man had found was not a teacher he could write to or argue with. It was a voice from the far side of the grave that seemed to know him better than anyone living did. He described it as looking into a mirror, one that gave back the world and life and his own soul with horrifying fidelity. To understand why a book could strike a 21-year-old that hard, you have to know what it said, because it is one of the bleakest and most honest things anyone has ever written down. Schopenhauer looked at the universe and concluded that underneath everything there is no God, no plan, no kindly purpose steering events. There is only what he called the will, and by that he did not mean anyone's particular wishes, but a single blind, restless force pushing through all of existence, the same urge that drives a root down into the soil and a person toward the thing they think they want. It has no aim beyond itself. It wants and gets and wants again. It never arrives anywhere. And because that is the engine humming underneath us, Schopenhauer said, life can only ever be suffering. Watch your own days closely and you will see the machinery turning. You want something, you do not have it, and the lack sits in you like a low ache. You get it. The relief lasts an afternoon, and then either a new want opens beneath the old one, or worse, nothing does, and you are left with the flat grey boredom of having nothing left to chase. Pain when you want, boredom when you don't. The wanting creature swings between them forever, because the will does not actually want satisfaction. Satisfaction would be the end of it. The will wants only more wanting. From this he drew a conclusion as clean as it was crushing. If life is essentially suffering, and the suffering comes from wanting, then the only real wisdom is to stop wanting. Turn down the volume of desire until it falls quiet, and step off the wheel altogether. Schopenhauer admired the saints and ascetics of the East for exactly this, for starving the will until it loosened its grip, and at the very bottom of his philosophy lay a verdict that wise souls in many cultures had reached long before him, that it would have been better, on the whole, never to have been born at all. This is pessimism in its purest form. It is a long, reasoned, dignified no to life itself. You can see why it seized a young man who had just lost his God. Everyone around him was still living as though the old comforts held, as though the universe were watching and meaning would sort itself out in the end. Here, at last, was someone who had refused the comfort entirely, walked all the way down into a world without heaven, and come back to report honestly on what was actually there. For a while, Schopenhauer was less a philosopher to him than a confessor and a hero, and he would carry that pessimism in his blood for years. It is worth sitting for a moment with the possibility that Schopenhauer was simply right. It is easy in daylight to wave the whole thing off as the gloom of a bitter old man, but you have probably met the thought yourself, late, once the distractions fall away. The quiet suspicion that all the wanting and striving really does lead nowhere in particular, that the things you chase never quite deliver what their wanting seemed to promise, that the whole restless business might genuinely not be worth the trouble. Schopenhauer built that small-hour suspicion into a cathedral. Nothing in this story will make the suspicion vanish, and the man at the centre of the story never managed to make it vanish either. He only learned, slowly, to answer it. Because this is where the young reader and the dead master began, very gradually, to part company. He granted almost the whole of the diagnosis: no God and a world of blind striving in which to be alive is to suffer. What he could not finally swallow was the cure. Something in him refused to meet a hard life by wanting less of it, by turning away, by treating existence as a sentence to be served quietly and then escaped. The question that would drive everything he ever wrote was already forming in him here, in its earliest shape. If Schopenhauer is right about how bad it is, no God, no rescue, suffering all the way down, is it still possible to say yes to such a life? Not to grit your teeth and endure it, but to want it, to love it. That single, nearly impossible question is the seed from which the whole of his philosophy would grow, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer it without telling himself a lie. He did not have to work on it alone for long. In the autumn of 1868, in a Leipzig drawing room, he was introduced to the composer Richard Wagner, and something in him that had been waiting since a sick room 20 years before came suddenly alive. Wagner was 55, magnetic and monstrously gifted, impossible to stand near without being pulled into his orbit. He was also a passionate disciple of Schopenhauer and a worshipper of music, the two loves the young man had been carrying around like contraband. They talked for hours, and there was a coincidence almost too neat to bear. Wagner had been born in 1813, the very year Nietzsche's own father had been born. The boy who had lost his father at 4 had found, 2 decades on, a towering older man into whom he could pour all that stored devotion. He called the friendship the single greatest achievement of his life, and for a few years he was half adopted into the household at Wagner's villa by a Swiss lake. What drew him was not only the affection. In Wagner, he believed he was looking at a living answer to Schopenhauer's no. Here was a man who held, as deeply as anyone, that the world was a churn of blind suffering, and who responded by pouring out enormous works of art, as if to drown the darkness in sound rather than flee from it. If existence could produce that, the young man thought, then perhaps existence could be redeemed after all, made bearable, even glorious, through the things human beings are able to make. It was the first faint hint of an answer to his impossible question, and he loved the man who seemed to embody it with the whole of his heart. That this love would one day curdle into the bitterest enmity of his life was not yet visible to him. For these few years, it was simply the closest to happiness he would ever come. The world, meanwhile, had decided he was a prodigy. At 24, before he had even finished the doctorate that was supposed to come first, the University of Basel, offered him a full professorship of classical philology, an honour almost unheard of for a man so young. He accepted, and in doing so he made a small, strange decision that reads now like a quiet omen. To take the Swiss post, he surrendered his Prussian citizenship, and he never took up any other in its place. From that spring onward, to the very end of his life, he belonged to no country at all. The most promising young scholar in Germany was, on paper, a man with no homeland, already before he had any idea of it, the wanderer he was going to become. Somewhere in your own life, there has probably been a book, or a song, or a particular person that put words to something you had carried for years without being able to name. And the relief of being seen like that is enormous, even when the thing being named is dark. That is what Schopenhauer was for him. But being seen is only the beginning. Sooner or later, the book closes, and you are left holding the harder matter. Not whether the bleak picture is accurate, but what on earth you mean to do about it. Lower your wants and drift quietly toward the exit, the way the old master advised, or stay and somehow find a way to want the whole difficult business anyway. He had chosen, without quite knowing it yet, to stay, to go looking for a yes inside a world that seemed to offer every reason for no. That is a heavy thing to set down and carry, and it does not need carrying tonight. Let it rest where it is. The question of whether suffering can ever be embraced instead of escaped will still be there whenever you wake, patient as it has always been. As for the young professor, his first real attempt to answer it would not come from argument at all. It would come from the people he had spent his whole education among, the ancient Greeks, who had stared into precisely this darkness long before Schopenhauer ever gave it a name, and had done something with it that no one since had fully understood. There is an old Greek story about a king who captured a demigod. The king was Midas, the one later cursed with the golden touch, and the creature he ran down in the forest was Silenus, a fat, drunken old companion of the wine god, said to be wiser than any mortal alive. Midas wanted that wisdom. He held the old satyr fast and demanded to be told the single best thing a human being could hope for. Silenus refused, and laughed, and refused again, until at last he gave it up. The very best thing, he said, is utterly beyond your reach, not to have been born, not to be nothing at all. And the second best? The second best is to die soon. That is a Greek telling it, not a medieval monk, not some northern pessimist brooding in a cold study, but a voice out of the sunlit world we were all taught to picture as the cheerful childhood of civilization, the white temples and the reasonable men in togas. The young professor had spent his whole life inside that world, reading its languages before dawn, and he had noticed something his colleagues seemed determined not to see. The Greeks were not naive. They had looked straight into the same darkness Schopenhauer would map 2,000 years later, and they had named it just as bleakly. The wisdom of Silenus sat there at the very bottom of their imagination. And yet, this was the puzzle that lit up his first book. These same people, who knew in their bones that it might have been better never to be born, did not crawl off to renounce the world. They built the Parthenon. They carved gods out of marble that seemed to glow from inside. They filled their theatres with the most vital art the West had ever produced. How does a civilization stare into that abyss and answer it? Not with a shrug or a suicide, but with beauty. That question became the seed of everything he would go on to think, and his answer arrived in the shape of two gods. The first was Apollo, god of light and music and prophecy, and Nietzsche made his name stand for a force he saw running through all of Greek art, the drive toward shape and boundary, toward the bright and finished individual thing. Think of a sculpture. A single human figure, perfectly bounded, lifted out of the chaos of the world and made to stand there gleaming and complete. That is the Apollonian impulse, the same one we know from dreams, where images rise up clear and luminous, and we are content for a while simply to watch them. The radiant Olympian gods were themselves a kind of collective dream the Greeks dreamed in self-defense. To bear the terror of being alive, they conjured a whole heaven of glorious, deathless figures who made existence look not merely endurable, but enviable. Apollo is the beautiful surface, lovingly built, that keeps you from falling into what lies beneath. The second god was the one underneath. Dionysus, Dionysus, god of wine, of intoxication, of the vine that dies every winter and comes back every spring. Where Apollo draws the bright outline of the individual, Dionysus dissolves it. In the old festivals of the wine god, dancing and drunk and swept up in music, a person stopped being a single separate self and melted back into the crowd, into the churning oneness of everything that the daylight self spends its whole life holding at arm's length. It was terrifying, and it was ecstatic at once. The loss of yourself experienced as a kind of homecoming. Music was its purest art, because music skips past pictures and words and reaches straight into that wordless flood. The Dionysian is the truth Apollo's lovely surfaces are built to hide, that beneath all our careful separateness there runs one vast, suffering, deathless current, and that we are only waves upon it, breaking and gone. Greek tragedy, Nietzsche argued, was the moment those two gods met and held each other in balance, and that balance was the highest thing human beings have ever made. Out of the Dionysian chorus, the music and the swaying mass, rose the Apollonian figures on the stage, the hero with a name and a face, the clear shape of a story. So an audience could be brought to look directly at the most unbearable things, at fate and the ruin of a good and noble person, for no reason anyone could accept and could bear to look, because all of it had been given form and lifted into something close to holy. Sit on one of those stone benches yourself in the grey light before sunrise and watch a hero walk step by step into a doom he cannot escape. Notice the strangeness of what happens in you. You are not crushed. You are somehow steadied, even exalted, because the worst thing in the world has been turned into the most beautiful thing you have ever seen. You feel the abyss and are reconciled to it in the same breath. This was the Greek secret, and it was the first real answer the young man found to the great refusal he had read on that sofa. Schopenhauer had said, "Existence is suffering, so turn away." The Greeks said, "Existence is suffering, so make it beautiful and stay." He pressed the whole vision into a single line he would circle back to for the rest of his life, that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon, only as a work of art, that existence and the world are finally justified. You have felt this yourself, almost certainly, without ever needing the theory. There is a particular kind of sad song, you have one of your own, that does not deepen the sadness so much as hold it, give it a shape, make it for 3 or 4 minutes into something you would not trade away. Grief set to music stops being only grief. A loss written down with enough care turns strangely close to a gift. That small, ordinary miracle, the turning of pain into something whose look you can love, is exactly what Nietzsche believed the Greeks had built a whole civilization upon, and it is the quiet beginning of his lifelong effort to say yes to a world that offers so much reason to say no. So who broke it? Tragedy did not simply fade in his telling, it was killed, and the murderer is the most startling name he could have named. It was Socrates, the ugly, endlessly questioning old man, whom almost everyone since has treated as the founding hero of clear thinking. Socrates carried a faith so deep he could die for it, that the world is fundamentally reasonable, that anything at all can be understood if you only think hard enough, and that knowledge, pushed far enough, can heal any wound existence inflicts. It is a profoundly hopeful idea, and Nietzsche thought it was poison to the tragic spirit. A people who believe every problem has a solution slowly lose the capacity to stand in front of the unsolvable and make it beautiful. Through a playwright named Euripides, who carried this new hunger for explanation onto the stage, the Dionysian mystery was drained out of drama. The characters began to reason and justify themselves like men in a courtroom, and the old, terrible music went quiet. The tragic age ended, and the long age of the confident problem-solving mind began. The age, Nietzsche suspected, that we are still living in, and still mistaking for the only way a person can possibly think. It was a thrilling, reckless, gorgeous argument, and in 1872 he published the whole of it as The Birth of Tragedy. He seems to have imagined the book would announce him to the world. It nearly destroyed him instead. The trouble was that it looked nothing like the scholarship his profession demanded. It marshalled almost no evidence. It built its history out of intuition and longing. It read, frankly, like a hymn to Richard Wagner, with the Greeks pressed into service as the choir. And a rival classicist, a young man named Wilamowitz, V.I.H. Lamovitz, barely 23 years old and ferociously gifted, fell on it with a pamphlet that jeered at it as a kind of philology of the future, a sneer lifted straight from the critics who mocked Wagner's music of the future. The charge was that Nietzsche had betrayed his own discipline, traded honest research for mystical fog, and had no business holding a university chair at all. Here is the uncomfortable part. By the rules of the game he had chosen to play, the attack landed because so much of it was fair. As a piece of careful classical scholarship, the book really is a wild thing, short on proof and long on vision, far closer to a manifesto than to research. If your standard is the patient gathering of evidence, Wilamowitz had caught him out, and most of the learned world quietly agreed. The cost came fast, and it was real. His standing among the philologists collapsed. He became a cautionary tale traded in faculty corridors, and in the lecture halls of his own university, the students simply stopped coming, until one term he was reportedly left teaching almost no one at all. The most promising young classicist in the German-speaking world had turned himself, at 27, into an embarrassment to his entire field. What lifts it above an academic squabble is that he had done it to himself, with his eyes wide open. Nothing had forced him to write a strange and dangerous book. The safe, glittering career was right there for the taking, and he had set fire to it on purpose, for the sake of saying something he believed was true. It is the first clear sighting of the pattern that would run through the whole of his life. Offered the choice between comfortable respectability and an unsettling truth, he reached for the truth every time and paid for it every time. Even he, years later, would look back and wince at the book, calling it clumsy and half embarrassing. The careful scholars, in other words, were right about the footnotes. They were only wrong about the thing that mattered, because folded inside that messy young book was the idea he would spend his remaining sane years refining, that art is how a human being says yes to a world built on suffering, and that the deepest such yes deserved the name of the wine god. They won the argument. He kept the secret. For the moment, the secret did him no good at all. He was a marked man in his profession, and his body, never strong to begin with, had started its own slow withdrawal. The headaches arriving more often, the eyes aching at the page, the long illnesses settling in to stay. The dark that the Greeks had learned to shape into something beautiful was, for him, simply gathering. The same dark is in your room tonight, of course. Only the ordinary dark behind your eyelids, which asks nothing of you and holds nothing in it that cannot keep until morning. He had less and less ground left to stand on, and would soon do the only thing still open to a man who had lost almost everything meant to anchor him, his God, and now his place in the world alike. He would walk out of all of it, up into the thin air of the mountains, and try to think it through alone. A narrow path runs along the side of a mountain, high in the Swiss Alps, in the long gold light of a summer evening, and a man is walking it slowly, alone. He is not young anymore, though he is not old either. He holds himself a little stiffly, and every so often he stops and presses the heel of one hand against his eye, as if he could push the pain back down. His sight is so poor that the lake far below is only a smear of brightness, and the green slopes blur into the grey rock above them. He has been walking for hours, and he will walk for hours more, because walking is one of the few things that helps. When he sits still, the headaches come, and the long, bright agony behind the eyes that can shut him in a darkened room, vomiting for days at a stretch. So he walks, and as he walks, he stops now and then to pull a small notebook from his coat and scratch a few lines into it, in a hand that has grown enormous and clumsy because he can barely see the page. This was his life for most of a decade, and almost everything he is remembered for was written exactly like this, in fragments, on foot, by a man whose own body had declared war on him. He had walked away from everything to get here. In 1879, at the age of 34, his health finally made the decision for him. He gave up the professorship at Basel, the chair he had reached so young and so brilliantly, and the university, half out of pity and half out of relief, granted him a small pension to live on. It was not much, but it was enough, if he was careful, to let him become what he became, a man without a post or a country of his own, drifting across Europe in search of a climate his body could bear and never staying anywhere more than a few months at a time. A pattern settled in that would hold for years. The summers he spent high up in a thin-aired valley called the Engadine, in a tiny village named Sils Maria, where the air ran cool and dry and the mountains stood close. Sils Maria suited him better than anywhere else on earth. He would take a plain room in a plain house, eat at the same hours every day, and walk out under the enormous sky along the lakes for hours, with no one to talk to and nothing to break the slow turning of his thoughts. The winters he chased south, to Nice on the French coast, or to Genoa, or to Turin, hunting sun and warmth. He had once been the most promising young scholar in Germany, half adopted into the most glamorous household in Europe. Now he was a half-blind man in a rented room, writing books almost nobody bought, eating his meals alone. The last great tie had snapped a little before all of this, and it had been the most painful loss of his life. The composer he had loved past all reason, the man he had called the greatest thing that ever happened to him, had drifted somewhere he could no longer follow. It came to a head at the enormous festival Wagner built for himself at Bayreuth, in 1876, which should have been the triumph of everything the two of them shared, and which Nietzsche found to his dismay almost unendurable. The vulgar crowds, the German flag-waving, the whole reek of self-congratulation. And then there was the music itself. Wagner's last opera, Parsifal, came soaked in Christian holiness, in grail quests, and the redemption of the world through pity. And to a man who had spent years climbing out from under exactly that, it felt like a betrayal of everything they had once stood for together. In 1878, the two of them exchanged books in the mail, almost without a word. Wagner sending the sacred libretto of his opera, Nietzsche sending a cold, clear-eyed book of his own that had left the old enchantment behind. The two packages passed each other somewhere in the post, and the friendship was finished. They never met again. He had cut the last cord that bound him to anyone alive, and now he was free, and now he was entirely alone. Here is the thing worth holding on to about these years, because it is the strangest and most important thing in the whole story. Out of all of this, the blindness and the sickness, the loneliness of the rented rooms, the final loss of the one man he had loved like a father, came the most life-affirming philosophy anyone in the modern age has written. A man whose own body gave him almost nothing but pain spent these years working out, sentence by careful sentence, how a person might learn to love being alive. That calm, unhurried voice that rises off his pages, the voice that sounds as though it is speaking to you from some serene height where everything has been seen and understood and forgiven. That voice belonged to a man who was frequently too sick even to read, who measured out his few good hours like a poor man counting coins and spent them writing hymns to joy in the narrow gaps between attacks. It looks like a contradiction, and it is not one, only something harder to sit with. That golden calm was never the overflow of a contented life. He was building it, plank by careful plank, precisely because his life would not hand it to him on its own. And it is fair even now to wonder which it truly was. When a man in this much pain tells you that life is good, that suffering can be embraced, that you ought to want your existence exactly as it is that hard-won wisdom, the report of someone who has been all the way down and found something real waiting at the bottom? Or is it something more desperate and more human? The story a person must tell himself out loud, over and over, simply to keep getting up and walking. The honest answer is that you cannot always tell the two apart, and there is good reason to think he could not always tell them apart either. For now, it is enough to notice that the serenity was never a gift he was given. It was something he made by hand, out of a life that had every excuse to lie down and quit. If you have ever lain in a dark room with your whole skull throbbing, hour after hour, waiting for a pain that does not seem to want to pass, then you know one small corner of what his ordinary days were built from, the way the body can turn into a place you are trapped inside, an enemy you cannot escape because it happens to be you. And you may know the choice that comes afterward when the worst of it finally loosens. The small, unremarkable decision to get up anyway, to put your feet on the floor and go on with no promise at all that tomorrow will be any kinder. He made that decision thousands of times. The whole of his philosophy, in a sense, is an effort to make that one ordinary decision beautiful, to find a reason not merely to survive another day, but to want it. And then, on one of those long walks, the reason seemed to arrive of its own accord. It was August of 1881. He was wandering beside a mountain lake near a place called Soleil, when he stopped beside a huge pyramid of rock that rose straight up out of the ground beside the path. Something came to him there, standing in that high, clear air with the water shining below him. Some thought so large and so strange that he could barely hold it. A single idea that seemed to gather up his whole long question about suffering and saying yes, and fold it into something almost too heavy to lift. He scribbled a note on a scrap of paper, marking the place and the height. 6,000 feet above the sea, he wrote, and much higher than that above all merely human things. It would take him years to work out what the thought even meant, and in time, it would become the heaviest and most demanding idea he ever set down. Notice while you lie there how your own breathing has already slowed, how the body that carries you has gone quiet and easy in a way his almost never could. Let that ease be yours for as long as you want it. Nothing here is asking you to climb anything tonight. He had no such mercy from his own. He came down off the mountain, still turning the great vision over, and it would be a long while before he could say even to himself what it fully held. But that strange, heavy thought was not the thing that would make his name or break it. Somewhere in those same wandering years, in the same thin and lonely air, he had already set down 3 short words, plain and hard as a stone, and the whole century to come would carry them off and carve them onto monuments he would have despised, without once stopping to ask what he had actually meant by them. On a bright, ordinary morning, the sun well up, the day already busy, a man lights a lantern. Not at dusk, not down in a cellar, but in the full, clear light of an ordinary forenoon, and he carries the burning thing out into the market square, where the stalls are crowded and people are going about their business. He runs among them, holding it up, crying the same words over and over. "I seek God. I seek God." And the people in the square laugh at him. Here is the first thing to notice, the thing almost everyone misses. The people laughing are not the faithful. They are the ones who have already given God up. The modern, comfortable unbelievers, the sort who would tell you with a small smile that they have grown out of all that. One of them calls out, "Has God got lost then, like a child? Has he wandered off somewhere or emigrated?" They find the whole performance delicious, and it is at these people, the cheerful ex-believers who are sure that nothing important has changed, that the madman wheels around and the laughter dies in their throats. Because this is the scene Nietzsche built to carry the 3 words everyone thinks they already understand. Strip away 100 years of careless quotation and look at what is actually written on the page. The line is not a victor's shout, but a cry of pure horror torn out of a man standing in a marketplace full of people who have no idea what they have done. "Where has God gone?" he demands of them. "I will tell you. We have killed him. You and I. All of us are his murderers. We killed him, not with a single blow, and not in any one lifetime. The West put its own God to death slowly, across centuries, using its own finest tools. Its appetite for truth, its refusal to keep believing a thing simply because the believing felt good. And the bitter irony is that this very appetite was something the faith itself had spent 1,000 years training into its people. "Be honest," Christianity had said, "seek the truth, for God is truth." So they sought it, more and more relentlessly, until at last the search swung around and turned its gaze on the faith itself, and found it could no longer be honestly held. The believer's own deepest virtue had quietly cut the throat of the thing they believed in. That is what he means by we. Nobody planned it. Everybody did it. And so the madman hammers it home as a kind of dreadful refrain. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. Then he does something very strange for a man who is supposed to be celebrating. He does not say, "And now we are free." He pours out instead a torrent of frightened questions, some of the most vertiginous sentences ever written. Who handed us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it rolling now? Where are we rolling? Backward, sideward, forward, in every direction at once? Are we not falling endlessly? Has it not grown colder? Listen to what he is actually saying under the questions. God for him was never merely a person up in the sky to send your prayers to. God was the horizon itself, the one fixed point that gave the whole world a direction and a scale, a sense that everything was, in the end, headed somewhere. Pull a thing like that out of the picture, and you have not lost a single item out of the world. You have lost the frame the entire world was hanging in. This is why those 3 words weigh so much more than "there is no God in the sky." For something like 2,000 years, nearly everything that gave a European life its solidity had been pinned, when you traced it down far enough, to that one fixed point. What finally makes an act good rather than evil, and why a hard truth should ever be worth more than a soft and comforting lie? Answers to questions like these had always, at the very bottom, come to rest on God. Knock the bottom out, and the whole structure is already secretly in freefall, and the only reason almost no one feels it is that very large buildings come down very slowly. The madman is called mad for one reason. He is the single person in that square who can feel the building coming down, while everyone around him is chatting and trading and laughing in rooms that are quietly plunging through the dark. At last he sees that they cannot hear him, and he goes quiet. He looks at the blank, amused faces and says, "I have come too early. My time is not yet here. This enormous event is still on its way, still travelling toward you. The light of a star that has already burned out can keep arriving for centuries after the star itself has gone cold." Then he throws his lantern down so that it smashes and the flame gutters out, and he walks into the churches and sings the prayer for the dead over them. And when they haul him out and ask what on earth he is doing, he only answers, "What are these churches now, if not the tombs and gravestones of God?" It is impossible to read this and not see the man himself standing inside the figure, holding up a light nobody asked for, talking to a century that was not ready to listen, and beginning to understand that he had arrived 100 years too soon. There is one last turn of the screw, and it is the quiet, devastating part. Even after a god dies, its shadow does not disappear all at once. For centuries after the Buddha was gone, Nietzsche noted, his vast shadow was still being shown in a cave. And God is dead, but given the way human beings are, there may be caves for thousands of years yet in which his shadow goes on being displayed. And we still have the long, hard work of defeating the shadow too. What is the shadow? It is everything we kept after we stopped believing in the thing that once justified it. We go on feeling, most of us, that cruelty is genuinely wrong and not just unfashionable, that the weakest person is worth precisely as much as the strongest, that history itself is somehow tilted, however gradually, toward the good. That whole moral inheritance is Christianity's furniture, and we have kept the furniture exactly where it stood, long after quietly removing the floor it was resting on. Set yourself, for a moment, inside the picture he is painting, because the odds are good that you are standing in that shadow right now. Somewhere in you, there are convictions you have never once reasoned out from the ground up, that the suffering of a child is a real horror and not merely an unpleasant sensation, that you owe an honest answer to someone who trusts you, even when a lie would cost you nothing. Push hard on where those came from, and you may find underneath them the foundations of a faith you no longer hold, the way a person can inherit a house from an ancestor whose name they never learned. And you may know the smaller, colder version of the madman's vertigo too. That moment, almost always in the dark, when the bottom seems to drop quietly out of all your certainties at once, and you catch yourself wondering whether it matters, is anything more than a sound people make to keep themselves warm. That brief chill, gone by morning, is a few seconds of his ordinary noon. In fairness, here is the strongest objection against him, and it carries real force. More than 100 years have passed, and the catastrophe he forecast has not, on the surface, arrived. God did die for enormous numbers of people, and the sky did not fall. Whole societies turned thoroughly secular and failed to dissolve into savagery. Many grew gentler instead, with more mercy in them, and more rights spread to more people than any God-fearing age ever managed. Thoughtful and humane people have argued ever since that he simply got it wrong, that goodness and meaning never needed a heavenly anchor at all, that we can ground our decency well enough in one another and in reason, in the plain shared fact that we are all of us, only briefly here together. On that reading, the things we kept were never a borrowed shadow at all, but genuine discoveries that stand on their own legs, and the only reason he expected them to topple is that he could not picture a flaw that was not God. There is no way from where any of us is standing to settle the argument. The answer he would surely give is that the bill has not yet come due, that we are still living on capital we did not earn, still warmed by a sun that set generations back, and that the real reckoning waits somewhere far out ahead, where the thunderclap is still on the road. Perhaps he was a grieving man who mistook his own loss for the fate of the world. Or perhaps he was the one figure in that whole busy square who could feel the cold beginning to come on, while everyone else was still laughing at the fool with the lantern. The honest position is that you cannot yet know which, and that not knowing is exactly where he meant to leave you. And it would be a mistake to hear only doom in him. He gave the book this scene appears in a strange, glinting title, The Gay Science, Joyful Wisdom, and the title is no joke. For all the dread in the parable, he believed that once the first terror had passed, the death of God would feel to anyone strong enough to bear it like an immense opening. The horizon gone, yes, but with it every wall and every fence. The sea, as he put it, lying open again as it never had before, every voyage suddenly permitted. That was the freedom on the other side of the fear. Feel, even now, how the whole heavy question has begun to loosen its grip as you have grown warmer and further from the day, and let it loosen. It is an old question, and it will be here, perfectly intact, whenever you decide to take it up again. What truly frightened the madman was never the emptiness itself, but the thing he was certain would come rushing in to fill it. A throne does not stay vacant for long, in a nation or in a human heart, and whatever climbs up to sit where God used to sit is very often no kind of improvement at all. That was the danger he would spend the last of his strength trying to make us see before it arrived. The danger he feared most did not announce itself as a danger at all. It looked like an ordinary, pleasant evening, very probably like the one you are having right now. The room sits at the temperature you set it to. Something is playing or scrolling, fed to you by a machine that has learned, with enormous patience, exactly what will keep you mildly content and reaching for the next thing. If you are hungry, food can be at the door in minutes. Nothing in the next few hours will frighten you or ask anything of you or carry the smallest risk of real failure. You are not suffering. You are not in danger. By every measure, the whole long, bloody history of the species would recognize you are astonishingly safe and astonishingly comfortable. And somewhere underneath all of it, very faint, there is a thin grey feeling you cannot quite name, the sense that none of it finally matters very much, the sense that you could not say, if someone asked you outright, what any of it is actually for. Hold on to that thin grey feeling, because it has a name, and so does the person it may slowly be turning you into. He saw both of them coming, from a freezing rented room more than 100 years before you sat down. When the old god dies, and the fixed point that held meaning and value and purpose in place is gone, something has to move into the empty space, and the first thing to arrive is the guest nobody invites. In the private notebooks he filled during those wandering years, pages he never finished and never published, he wrote down the clearest description of it anyone has managed. "Nihilism stands at the door," he wrote. "Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests?" And then, plainly, nihilism is the condition in which the highest values lose their value, and the question, why, finds no answer at all. Not that this or that particular thing is bad, that nothing, finally, is worth anything, that there is no longer any real reason to do one thing rather than another, or to get up in the morning rather than not. The cruel part is that this guest does not break in from outside. It is the West's own honesty, simply arriving at its destination, the same hunger for truth that quietly killed God, refusing to stop there, turning on every other comforting story in the house until the honest mind is standing in a room it has stripped completely bare. Faced with that guest at the door, he thought, a person has only a few ways to answer. You can give way to it, surrender, want nothing, let the emptiness win, and dress the surrender up as a kind of serenity. You can take the hard and lonely road and use the stripped bare room to build some new meaning of your own. Or you can refuse to open the door at all and bury the whole unbearable question under a soft, unending supply of small pleasures. It was that last answer, the comfortable refusal, that he was certain was coming for the modern world, and he gave it a face nobody who reads him ever quite forgets. To draw that face, he invented a character. In the strangest and most personal book he ever wrote, a prophet named Zarathustra, an old Persian name, comes down from years of solitude in the mountains, his heart overflowing, to give humanity a gift, a vision of how high a human being might still climb, even now, even with heaven standing empty. He offers the crowd that height, and the crowd is not the least bit interested. So, almost in despair, he shows them the opposite instead, the thing he is most afraid they will choose. He shows them the last man. The last man is what becomes of humanity once it has decided that comfort is enough. He has met the death of God and the threat of the abyss, and he has solved them the easy way, by shrinking his wants down so small that nothing can ever disappoint him again. He has, in Zarathustra's phrase, invented happiness, and as he says the word, he blinks. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So the last man asks and blinks, because he no longer understands the questions. He takes a little poison now and then for pleasant dreams, and a good deal of it at the end for a pleasant death. He is careful of his health. Everyone wants the same things, and everyone is the same, and anyone still burning with some large, strange longing takes himself off voluntarily to the madhouse. He is warm and safe and perfectly harmless. And he is, to Nietzsche, the most contemptible thing a human being can turn into. Not because he is cruel, but precisely because he is content, because he feels no lack at all, because he has lost even the ability to despise himself, which would at least require him to still believe in some height he was failing to reach. Here is the moment that turns the whole scene from a sermon into a prophecy. When the prophet finishes describing this small, blinking, comfortable creature, fully expecting the crowd to recoil from it in horror, they cheer. "Give us this last man," they shout back at him. "Turn us into these last men. They do not want the height. They want the warmth." That was his verdict on where the modern world was actually heading, delivered with a despair you can still feel rising off the page. Not toward greatness, and not even toward some noble, tragic despair, but toward a contented, blinking smallness that people would never need to be forced into because they would line up and beg for it. This is the very center of what he was trying to warn us about. The death of God was never going to hand us a race of free, value-creating giants. For most people, most of the time, it was going to produce the last man, and the last man was going to be delighted, which is why your comfortable evening is not a small or innocent thing. The last man is not some monster waiting in a distant future. He is the easiest version of yourself, available to you every single night, and asking almost nothing in return. A life arranged so that it never frightens you and never fails you is also, by that very same arrangement, a life in which you never risk anything, never want anything badly enough to be wrecked by losing it, never climb high enough that a fall would matter. It is genuinely pleasant. That is exactly the trap. The quiet decision he is pressing into your hands, there in the warm room, is whether you will ever choose to want more than this, when more is so much harder and so much more likely to hurt, and the warmth is right here and free. There is one last way the empty room can be filled, and it is the one he dreaded above all the others. When people cannot bear the meaninglessness and will not do the lonely work of making a meaning of their own, they go hunting for a new god to hand themselves over to, a nation or a race, a strong man with a loud voice who promises to give them back, all at once, the certainty and the belonging and the purpose they have lost. The hollow place does not only breed comfortable nothings, it breeds desperate worshippers, ready to fall in behind whatever idol shouts the loudest. And the most savage irony in his entire story is that the very people who would one day carry off his name took precisely this road and draped their new idol in his stolen words. The man who pleaded with the world not to do it, refashioned into the prophet of the very thing he had pleaded against. It would be far too easy to simply nod along with all of this, so it is worth stopping to ask whether he had any right to sneer. Take the strongest objection to him head on. What he calls the contemptible happiness of the last man, the warmth, the safety, the long life without agony, is, seen from another angle, very close to the single greatest achievement of the human race. For nearly the whole of our time on earth, life was a savage business of plague and hunger and early death, of the strong feeding on the weak as a simple matter of course. The comfort he holds in such contempt is the hard-won fruit of medicine and law, of mercy slowly spread to people who never had any, the lifting of exactly the suffering that drowned every age he found so beautifully tragic. To call a life without torment despicable, to wish the many kept hungry and in danger so that a rare few might have something grand to overcome, can begin to look much less like wisdom and much more like a comfortable man's disdain for other people's hard-won peace. Perhaps the fed, safe, untroubled last man is not the death of humanity at all. Perhaps he is its rescue. He has his answer, of course. He would say that a life with all the suffering engineered out of it is also a life with all the height engineered out, that you cannot remove the danger of falling without quietly removing the chance of ever climbing, and that a person who has never once wanted anything fiercely enough to be broken by it has not, in the fullest sense, lived at all. Whether that is a deep truth, or only the beautiful cruelty of a man who romanticized a suffering he could not escape, he cannot decide for you, and no one else can decide it either. The honest thing is to feel both pulls at the same time, the pull of the warm, safe room, and the pull of the cold and dangerous height, and to notice, without forcing it, which one your hand reaches toward. None of this needs settling tonight, and the warm room is doing you no harm at all. Let it hold you, and let the question keep until the light comes back, when these things always look smaller and more manageable than they do in the dark. There is one more thing worth sitting with as you drift, though, and it is a strange one. The man who saw all of this coming from so far off, who diagnosed the comfortable death of the modern soul while shivering, half-blind and almost friendless in a cheap southern boarding house, was not, in the end, brought down by any of these vast and terrible ideas. He was about to be undone by the oldest and most ordinary thing there is. He was about to fall completely and disastrously in love. One photograph of Friedrich Nietzsche survives from the spring of 1882, and it is very far from the image he would have chosen to be remembered by. It was taken in a photographer's studio in the Swiss city of Lucerne. In the middle of the room sits a little wooden handcart, and two grown men have been buckled into a kind of harness at the front of it, where the oxen would normally go, standing there in the traces looking faintly ridiculous. One of them a distinguished professor of philosophy, 37 years old, the other his closest friend in the world. Up in the cart behind them, holding a length of cord for reins and a little whip with a sprig of lilac tied to its handle, sits a young woman of 21. And the man who dreamed up this entire absurd tableau, who insisted on it and fussed over every detail while his mortified friend begged him to reconsider, is the professor in the harness. It is Nietzsche, the coming prophet of hardness and solitude, got up as an ox for a girl with a whip. That photograph has been used for well over a century as a kind of evidence against him. It travels around almost always paired with his single most notorious sentence about women, the one about not forgetting your whip when you go to them, as though the picture were a confession and the woman the one who ought to be afraid. The truth runs almost exactly the other way, and it is worth setting straight, because getting it backwards has hidden one of the most human things about the man. He staged the scene himself. The whip was his own idea. And that infamous line had not even been written yet. It would arrive a year later, inside a book, spoken not in his voice at all, but by a shriveled old woman character, offering it up as a sly little joke. What the photograph actually shows is not a man cracking a whip over a woman, but a man so completely undone by love that he buckled himself and his dearest friend into a cart and put the whip in her hand. The woman in the cart was Lou von Salome, Lou Salome, and she was, by any measure, extraordinary. 21 years old, born in Russia, with a mind so quick and so fearless that it unsettled nearly everyone who came near it, she would go on across a long life to write books of her own, and later to think shoulder to shoulder with Freud himself. She had no wish to marry any of the brilliant men who fell at her feet. She did not want to be owned or made into anyone's wife. She wanted to read and argue and think freely with the finest minds she could find. And in the spring of that year, she came into the life of the lonely, ailing, 37-year-old philosopher like a comet falling into a dark field. They were brought together by an older woman friend, and standing right beside Nietzsche through all of it was his good friend Paul Ray, a fellow philosopher who was already half in love with Lou himself, and who had already, without Nietzsche's knowledge, proposed to her and been gently turned down. The three of them fell into a wild and scandalous plan. They would live together, all three, in a kind of chaste intellectual household, reading and thinking side by side, a little trinity of free spirits with no use for the ordinary rules. To a man who had spent years entirely alone in rented rooms, half blind and barely read, it promised everything he had given up on: company, equals, a woman of real genius who could follow him into his strangest and most dangerous thoughts and not flinch. He let himself hope, which was something he had nearly forgotten how to do. There was a day on a hill above a still northern lake, a place called Monte Sacro, the sacred mountain, when he and Lou climbed up alone together, and something happened between them that no one has ever quite been able to name. Lou, writing about it many decades later, would say only that she could no longer remember whether or not she had kissed him up there. Whatever it was, he fell, and he fell the whole way down. He sent Ray to ask her to marry him on his behalf. She said no. He asked her himself. She said no again. She liked him beyond almost anyone, revered his mind, wanted his friendship for the rest of her life, but she did not want him in that way, and she was not going to become any man's wife, his or anybody's. And then his sister arrived. Elizabeth, the same sister who, years later, would build her entire life around twisting his legacy, took a single look at this free-thinking, unmarried foreign young woman who had her cherished brother wrapped around one finger and set out to destroy her. Lou had agreed to spend a few weeks with the family, with Elizabeth installed as the proper chaperone, and Elizabeth used the time to wage a patient and vicious little war, branding Lou a Russian adventuress, dripping poison into every ear that mattered, their mother's and at last her brother's own. By the time she had finished, the bright little trinity lay in pieces. Ray and Lou drifted away together and would live side by side for years. Nietzsche was left with absolutely nothing. Lou gone, Ray gone off with her, his own family turned against him, and with the unbearable knowledge that the most luminous possibility of his entire life had slipped through his fingers, hurried along by his own sister's spite. That December, alone again in his cold rooms, he simply came apart. The letters he wrote that winter are wild things, swinging between fury and a grief so total it seems to have no flaw. He wrote of his contempt for himself, of the wish to be done with all of it. He took opium to force a few hours of sleep. By every honest account, he came nearer that winter to taking his own life than at any other point, before or after. The man who was about to teach the whole world how to say yes to existence was, just then, barely managing to keep hold of his own. And then the thing happened that is almost impossible to explain. Out of that precise wreckage, the rejection, the betrayal, the loneliness that had very nearly killed him, came the most ecstatic, life-drunk book he would ever write. In something like 10 days, in a kind of white fever, the entire first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra came pouring out of him. The book in which his prophet strides down off the mountain singing, the book that brims over with joy and a vast, defiant love of the earth and of being alive. The lowest point of his life produced his highest song. The despair did not block the yes. Somehow it became the yes. There are two honest things to set down beside the romance of that, because the romance on its own would be a lie of omission. The first is genuinely ugly, and it does not get to be quietly smoothed away. This same man, who needed Lou's mind as a true equal, who treasured the friendship of the formidable women who took him in, also wrote some of the cruelest and smallest sentences about women in the whole history of philosophy. Women as snares, as creatures to be kept firmly in their place. The contradiction is real, and it is not flattering, and the honest thing is to let it stand there, unflattering. The philosopher Bertrand Russell put a finger on it with a line that is hard to shake loose: that Nietzsche's entire view of women was really fear wearing the mask of contempt, the bitterness of a man badly wounded by them and frightened of them ever after. The second honest thing is quieter, and it cuts deeper. His whole gospel of yes, the love of fate, the embrace of life exactly as it comes, was hammered out, at least in part, by a man who could not have the one thing he wanted most in the world, who was refused, and refused again, and then betrayed under his own family's roof. So which was it? Was that great yes a hard-won wisdom dug up out of real suffering? Or was it the most beautiful story a desperately lonely man ever told himself, simply so that he could bear to rise the next morning and go on? There is no clean answer, and you may feel the pull of the question in your own life, because almost everyone has stood roughly where he stood. Almost everyone has wanted someone who did not want them back, has been turned down, has watched something precious drift quietly out of reach. And almost everyone knows the temptation that comes next, to let the loss shrink you, to want a little less the next time so that less can ever be taken away, which is, if you follow it far enough down, the very road that leads to the small, blinking comfort he so dreaded. He took the other road, the steeper one. He picked up the worst thing that had ever been done to him and turned it into the most alive thing he ever made. That is one answer, open to anyone, to the oldest question there is about pain. Whether a wound has to make you smaller, or whether, handled a certain way, it can make you sing instead. You are very likely carrying a few old losses of your own right now, the way everyone does, settled somewhere down under the ribs. You do not have to do a single thing with them tonight. Let them lie quiet in the dark and grow lighter as you do. They have waited this long, and they will keep until morning. What he managed to do with his is its own small comfort to remember as the day lets go of you, that even the very worst of it can be turned, given time, into something that sings rather than something that only aches. But the fever that produced his great hymn did not produce only a hymn. Having taught himself at terrible cost how to say yes to life, he turned next and went hunting for whatever had been quietly poisoning life all along. And this time the thing he set out to destroy was not God, but the oldest and most trusted idols any of us carry, the ideas of good and evil themselves. A flock of lambs grazes in a field, and from time to time the great birds of prey come down out of the sky and carry one of them off. The lambs, understandably, do not care for this, and among themselves, Nietzsche imagines, they work out a theory about it. These birds of prey are evil, they decide, and we lambs, who never carry anyone off, who are soft and gentle and harmless, must therefore be good. It sounds airtight if you happen to be a lamb. But notice what has quietly happened inside the reasoning. The lambs have taken their own weakness. They could not seize and carry off an eagle if their lives depended on it, and renamed it a virtue, a fine thing they have nobly chosen. They have taken the eagle's strength, which is simply what an eagle is, and renamed it a crime, as though the bird were free to wake one morning and decide to become a lamb instead. The eagle, for its part, bears the lambs no grudge whatsoever. Looking down, it thinks only, nothing in the world tastes better than a tender lamb. That little fable, Nietzsche believed, is the buried history of our entire morality. In the books that poured out after his great fever, Beyond Good and Evil, and then in 1887 the sharpest and most systematic of all, On the Genealogy of Morals, he set out to do something almost no one had dared, not to ask whether this or that act is good or evil, but to ask where the categories of good and evil themselves had come from. He called it a genealogy, a family tree of our most sacred ideas, traced patiently back to their roots. And the roots, he found, were not at all what we like to think. In the beginning, he argued, there was no evil anywhere. There were only the strong and the weak. And the strong, the nobles, the ones who acted and ruled and took what they wanted, looked at themselves and their lives and called all of it good. Good simply meant noble and full of life. Bad was just the leftover, the shrug they gave to the low and the common and the failed. This is what he called master morality, and there is nothing calculating in it. The powerful name themselves good out of sheer overflowing strength, the way health calls itself health, and then go on with their day. The strong simply say yes to themselves. But the weak, the ruled, the crushed, the ones with no way to strike back, could not openly call themselves good, because by the master's bright standard, they plainly were not. So they did something extraordinary, something that took a kind of dark genius. Unable to take their revenge out in the world, with their hands, they took it in the only place left to them, in the imagination, in the realm of values. They invented a new word. They invented evil, and the evil ones, they decided, were precisely the strong, the proud, the ones who act without asking permission. And the good ones, the truly good? The good ones were the meek and the humble, the ones who turn the other cheek, which is to say themselves. Their weakness, rechristened as virtue, their inability to strike, rechristened as the noble choice not to. There is a name for the engine of all this, and he borrowed it from French because no English word carried quite the right flavour of slow poison. Ressentiment, ressentiment, the stored, festering resentment of those who cannot act, which turns creative and gives birth to a whole new table of values designed so that the powerless come out on top. And here is the staggering part of the claim. This slave revolt in morality, as he called it, won. It is the very air almost all of us now breathe. The values we treat as eternal and self-evident, that meekness is blessed and the humble shall be exalted, that pity is the highest of all the virtues, these, Nietzsche said, are the victory monument of the slave's long, patient revenge. He located the great hinge of it in the priestly culture of ancient Israel and its triumph in Christianity, and this is exactly the spot where his words have been seized and twisted into something monstrous. So it has to be said plainly. He was not making a claim about race or blood. He was making a claim about psychology and history, and his attitude toward the achievement was closer to awe than to hatred. He called it the most spiritual revenge ever devised, a masterstroke by the powerless. Whatever you finally make of the theory, the venom in his actual life ran the other way entirely. He despised the anti-Semites of his own day, broke with friends and with his own family over their Jew hatred, and would have been physically sickened to find his name stitched onto their flags. The genealogy is an account of where a morality came from. It is not, and was never meant as, permission to hate a single living soul. Step back, and you can see the deeper and stranger thing he was doing. He was refusing the one assumption almost everyone shares without noticing it, that morality hangs above the human world like a set of plain facts, the same for everyone, handed down from nowhere in particular. The moment you ask where a morality came from and whom it serves, you have already stopped treating it as a fact and started treating it as a thing made by particular people for particular ends, a view from somewhere, not a view from nowhere. There are no moral facts floating in the sky, he thought. There are only moral perspectives, each one the expression of some particular kind of life straining to come out on top. And so the real question, the dangerous second-order question that almost no one had thought to ask, was no longer which of these rules is the correct one. It was, what is the value of our morality itself? What does it actually do to the people who live inside it? Whom does it make stronger, and whom does it quietly make sick? None of this is safely locked away in ancient history either. It is most likely happening inside you today. Think back to the last time someone slighted you, passed you over, or had the thing you wanted. Watch closely what the mind does next. It rarely plots open revenge. It does something quieter and far more comfortable. It begins to find reasons why the other person is small, shallow, or secretly a fraud, and why you, the one who did not get the thing, are in truth the finer human being, the deeper, more honest one, too good for the whole grubby business anyway. That warm, righteous glow, the one that magically turns your disadvantage into your superiority, is resentment, caught live in your own chest. His unsettling gift is that once you have seen the move, you cannot stop seeing it out in the world and in yourself, and you are left with a genuine choice each time it rises, to let the slight go, or to nurse it quietly and let it poison you, all the while dressed in the borrowed robes of virtue. Now comes the hard part, the part that ought to disturb you, because it disturbed every honest reader who ever followed him this far, and should have disturbed him more than it did. Suppose he is right. Suppose our whole tender architecture of compassion and equality, of care for the weak, really did grow up out of the resentment of people who could not fight back. What follows from that? The strongest objection cuts two ways at once. The first cut is simple. Even if compassion was born in resentment, that tells you exactly nothing about whether it is good. Where an idea came from and whether it is true are two entirely separate questions. A cure stumbled on by accident still cures, and the suffering of a weak person remains a perfectly real reason to help, whatever tangled history first taught us the impulse. The second cut is darker. If you do manage to dissolve the authority of morality, if "you must not be cruel" turns out to be nothing but the bleating of lambs who could never have been eagles, then what precisely is left to stop the eagles? He pulled the floor out from beneath good and evil, and he did not always seem troubled by what might come strolling in once it was gone. Some of his own conclusions about the strong and the weak are genuinely chilling, and they are his, written in his own hand, not his sister's later forgeries. This is the most dangerous room in the whole of his house, and being honest means standing in it a while without bolting for the door. To be fair to him, he was not simply cheering for the birds of prey. He thought the slave revolt, for all its long dishonesty, had made human beings infinitely more interesting than they had ever been, deeper, more inward, harder to fathom. His own ideal was never a return to the brute, happy, stupid master, but something genuinely new, a person who could carry the strength of the one and the depth the other had carved into us, and do it without the lie underneath. Whether that vision holds together, or whether he left us only a magnificent demolition and nowhere solid to stand, is a question the century after him would go on to answer in blood, and one that still cannot honestly be closed. Whatever grudges you happen to be carrying into the dark tonight, you can set them down at the edge of the bed. The room is quiet, and the night asks nothing of you, and by morning they will have loosened their grip the way these things nearly always do once the light comes back. Underneath all of it, though, beneath the lamb and the eagle, the good and the evil, the long revenge and the overflowing strength, Nietzsche was convinced he could make out a single force at work. One thing, he thought, drove the noble's careless yes to himself and the slave's patient no to his master alike. One engine turning beneath every value any human being has ever made. He gave that force a name, and it would go on to become the most stolen, most thoroughly misunderstood phrase in everything he ever wrote. Life is doing something stranger than simply staying alive. A seed falls into a crack in the pavement, somewhere no one is looking, and over a season it sends a thin root down into the dark and pushes a soft green shoot up toward the light until, given enough time, that fragile thing does something almost violent. It splits the concrete, not because it is fighting to stay alive exactly, because that is simply what life does. It grows, and it overcomes whatever stands in its way, That blind, patient, relentless pushing, the thing in the seed that cracks the stone, was, Nietzsche came to believe, the single force humming underneath everything that lives, and he gave it the name that would later be stolen and turned into a weapon. He called it the will to power. Notice first the word he did not use. He did not call it the will to survive or the will to live. Against the great scientific idea, conquering his century, that every creature is driven, before all else, to keep itself alive and pass on its kind, he insisted on something stranger and, to him, more honest. Self-preservation, he said, is only a side effect, an occasional byproduct, not the deep engine at all. Look at what living things actually do. They do not hunker down and conserve. They reach and overreach and spend themselves on things that put their own survival at genuine risk. What a living thing wants, above everything, is to discharge its strength, to grow, to overcome whatever resists it, to press itself out onto the world. Survival is only what sometimes happens along the way. Life is not trying to last, it is trying to overcome. Now, before another word, the wreckage has to be cleared away, because this phrase has spent a century buried under the worst misunderstanding any of his ideas ever suffered. Say, the will to power to most people, and they picture jackboots, the will to dominate, to crush, to grind other human beings under your heel. They picture a thick, sinister book of his by that very name, often treated as his secret masterwork. So here is the plain truth. He never wrote that book. He had once planned a great work under the title, and then, in 1888, he abandoned the plan completely and broke up the drafts to use elsewhere. The book that now carries the name was stitched together years afterward, once his mind had already gone dark by his sister, out of scraps and offcuts from his notebooks, pages he had thrown away, arranged to suit her purposes and sold to the world as his crowning testament. A great scholar would later say it as flatly as it can be said: the book does not exist. The fragments are real. The book is a forgery. And the meaning poured into the phrase by the people who built that forgery, power as conquest, power as the boot on the neck, is very nearly the opposite of what the man himself meant. What he meant, at its widest, was a guess at the one drive running beneath all of life, the sapling and the eagle, the artist and the saint, every one of them an expression of a single restless force, straining to grow and overcome and become always more than it is. It is not a wish and not a plan, and in most things not even conscious. It is just what life is doing at every moment, the way water moves downhill. The noble's overflowing yes to himself and the slave's long, patient revenge, the two faces of morality from before, were both, he thought, this same drive, finding different outlets, the strong discharging their power straight out into the world, the weak blocked from that, turning it inward into the slow and ingenious work of rewriting what good and evil even mean. But here is the part that flips the whole jackboot picture inside out, the part the thieves could never find a use for. The highest form of the will to power, the rarest and the noblest, is not in the end power over other people. It is power over yourself. The crude version of the drive conquers cities. The refined version conquers its own inner chaos. Picture the artist who masters a riot of feeling and forces it into the strict discipline of a form, or the thinker who turns the whole weight of his mind against his own most comfortable beliefs. The resistance they are overcoming is themselves, and that, to Nietzsche, is the supreme exercise of strength. He had a phrase for it he loved above almost any other: self-overcoming. To take the raw, unruly material you happen to be made of, the fears and appetites and inherited reflexes, and to master it, to shape it into something you actually chose. That is the will to power in its highest key. By this measure, the man who can command armies but not his own temper is weak. the one who rules nothing and no one, but who has made himself into something hard and clear and entirely his own, is strong. And this is not abstract. It is the exact reverse of what the slogan promises, and you have felt it yourself. There is a quiet, particular satisfaction that has nothing to do with beating anybody. The moment you held your tongue when everything in you wanted to lash out and chose the harder, better silence. The long, unglamorous mastery of some skill where the only thing you were ever overcoming was your own clumsiness and your own urge to quit. That satisfaction, deeper and cleaner than any victory over another person, is the thing he was pointing at. And it is worth standing for a moment exactly where he stood when he saw it. A sick, penniless man whom almost no one read, who held no power over anyone or anything in the outer world, and who poured the entire force of his enormous will into the one country still left to him, the mastering of his own mind and his own relentless pain. He wrote about power over the self rather than power over others because the self was the only ground he had left to stand on, and because it is the one kind of power that can never be taken away from a person. But is any of it actually true? Here is the strongest objection, and it bites. The will to power has a way of explaining absolutely everything, and that is precisely its weakness. If the conqueror reaching for an empire is the will to power, and the monk renouncing his every last desire is also the will to power, then what on earth could a person do that would not somehow count as the will to power? A theory that quietly absorbs every possible fact has not explained any of them. It has only renamed them all. The more deflating possibility is that this was less a discovery about the world than a lens Nietzsche fell in love with, a single master key he had decided would open every lock there is, which is exactly the kind of grand, tidy, all-explaining system he spent his whole life mocking in lesser philosophers. He may have caught himself near the end building the one thing he most despised. Perhaps he did, and yet, even if it fails as a final theory of everything, it works strangely well as a lamp to hold up to a single human life. Try it for a day. Ask of your own restlessness, your own odd flickers of cruelty and kindness, what each of them is quietly reaching to overcome. You may not crack the secret of the universe, but you will almost certainly see yourself a shade more clearly, which was always at least half of what he was really after. He cared less about being correct than about handing you a tool sharp enough to cut through your own comfortable stories about who you are. Feel, even now, the will at work in your own body. The heart doing its patient labor without ever being asked, the muscles that have carried you all day finally allowed to loosen their grip one by one. There is nothing left in the day that still needs overcoming. The hard climbing is finished. Let the body set itself down and rest, the way every living thing must in the end, and carry just this one thought down with you, gently. If life really is nothing but this endless overcoming, then a human being is never a finished thing, never a place where the story arrives and stops, only a stage in the overcoming, a bridge thrown out across a gap towards something further on. And he spent the strangest of all his books wondering aloud what stood on the far side of that bridge, what a human being might become if it ever found the strength to overcome even itself. A tightrope is strung across a deep gorge, from one cliff face to another, and out in the middle of it, with nothing at all underneath, a single figure is making the crossing. That is the picture his prophet Zarathustra holds up to the crowd when they ask him what a human being is. On the near cliff stands the animal, the beast, what we climbed up out of. On the far cliff stands something we have not yet become. And the human being is neither of those solid places. The human being is the rope, or the figure out on the rope, suspended over the drop, halfway across. Man is a rope, Zarathustra tells them, tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in a person, he says, is not that he is a destination, but that he is a bridge, a going across and a going under. We are not the point. We are the way across to the point. The thing waiting on the far cliff is the Übermensch, Übermensch, the overman, the overhuman, and it is, without any competition, the most stolen and most mangled idea he ever had. You have already met its corpse, dressed in costumes he would have despised. The master race of the Nazis, a breeding program, a bloodline of people born superior to the rest. The comic book hero, an invincible alien in a cape who flies. Even the word Superman is a kind of accident. An English playwright, George Bernard Shaw, borrowed it for a play, and it stuck, and the strong man in tights was born. Every one of these gets it wrong, and not slightly wrong. Backwards. So set the costumes aside and meet the real thing, which is quieter and far stranger than any of them. Remember where we are standing. God is dead. The old source of all meaning and value has gone silent, and the floor it held up is, secretly, already falling. The last man met that emptiness by shrinking down into comfort until nothing could trouble him. The overman is the exact opposite response. The human being who meets the very same emptiness and rises to it, who, finding no values handed down from any heaven, does the terrifying and magnificent thing of creating values of his own, out of his own affirmed life, and standing behind them with his whole weight. He is not stronger in the muscles, he is stronger in the soul. He is the one who can live in a world with no God and no given meaning, and not collapse into the void or shrink into the last man, but make meaning where there was none, the way an artist lays down the first stroke on a blank canvas. And here is the single line that should burn the whole misreading to the ground. Remain faithful to the earth, Zarathustra pleads with them. Do not believe the ones who promise you another world, a heaven waiting somewhere beyond this one. The overman is not a superhuman hovering above us and looking down. He is faithful to the earth, rooted in this life, this single existence, with no eternity to fall back on and no higher plane to escape to. That is the entire point. There is nothing above or beyond. The only world there is this one, and the only meaning there will ever be is the meaning a human being makes here, in the dirt, with no help coming. Which is exactly why the master race and the flying alien are not merely wrong, but precisely upside down. They both dream of a superior being arriving from somewhere else. The overman is the one who has given up somewhere else completely and chosen to belong bravely and entirely to the earth. One more correction, because it matters as much as any of them. Nietzsche never announced that the overman had arrived. He never pointed at anyone, himself included, and said, "There he is." Even Zarathustra, his own prophet, is not the overman. Zarathustra calls himself only the herald, the John the Baptist figure, crying out in the wilderness that something is coming. The overman is not a person who has ever lived. He is a direction, a horizon held out in front of humanity, the way you might hold out a reason to a person who has lost every reason to get out of bed. It is far less a prophecy of some coming race than a question set down in front of each of us. Now that the old meanings are dead, what will you make? Sit with that question for a moment, because it is genuinely his and it is aimed at you. Suppose, just for tonight, that nothing at all is handed to you. No rules from on high, no God keeping watch, no script for what a life is supposed to add up to, no list of what counts as a success or a goodness or a life well spent. Only you, and your one existence, and the vertigo of being free to decide what it is for. Most of us flee that freedom the instant we catch sight of it. We grab the nearest ready-made answer. what our parents wanted, or what everyone around us seems to be chasing, because the blank canvas is simply unbearable to stand in front of. The overman is the one who does not flee. And you have tasted the edge of it at least, that rare, lurching moment when you suddenly saw that some rule you had obeyed your whole life was only a rule, that no one was really enforcing it, that you could choose otherwise, and felt the ground tilt under you, half terror and half wild open sky. That feeling, built into an entire way of living, is what he was reaching for. But now the hardest question, the one that ought to leave you uneasy, because it is the very crack the thieves slipped through. Create your own values sounds magnificent. It is also completely empty. If there are no values handed down, nothing above the human world to measure against, then by what standard do you tell a great soul from a monster? Picture two people who have each thrown off all inherited morality and authored values entirely their own. One is Goethe, serene and overflowing and generous, a vast human being who turned his whole life into something close to a work of art. The other is a tyrant who has decided that his own glory is the only value there is, and the rest of us are merely raw material for it. By Nietzsche's own logic, both have done precisely what the overman is meant to do, refused the herd's morality and made values of their own. He plainly meant the first man and not the second, and yet his philosophy hands us no clean way to say why, no standard to separate the creator from the destroyer. That missing standard, that empty space where a measure should be, is the open door through which his sister and her friends would one day drag the whole idea and hang their monsters from it. He had instincts here, even without a system. He clearly believed the true creator would carry a certain quality, a kind of fullness and self-command, a generosity that overflows rather than a hunger that devours, that the tyrant is not strong at all but sick, still driven by the very resentment the overman has finally left behind. The real creator, he hinted, makes things out of abundance, while the monster only smashes them out of lack. Whether that distinction can actually bear the weight, or whether it was finally just a hope he could not back up, is among the great unfinished questions he left lying around. And tellingly, after he had painted the overman so vividly in that one strange singing book, he almost never spoke of it again. The most famous idea he ever had quietly vanishes from his later work, as though even he could not finish the thought. Notice how the great question, what would you make if it were truly all left up to you, softens as you sink down towards sleep, how it stops sounding like a demand and starts to feel more like an open field you might wander into some unhurried morning. Let it go loose. It is not a thing to be answered in the dark. There was one more demand he made, though, of anyone who would dare to be that free, that faithful to the earth, that wholly responsible for the meaning of their own life. Before you could create a single value worth having, he thought, you had first to pass a test, the cruelest and most beautiful test he ever devised, the kind that either crushes a person on the spot or sets them free for good. He imagined it as a visitor, slipping into your room in the dead of night, leaning close and asking you one quiet, annihilating question. It is late, and you are alone in the dark, which is precisely where he imagined it would happen. Into that loneliness, your loneliest loneliness, he called it, a visitor comes. He named it a demon, though it does not shout or threaten. It leans in close, almost tenderly, and it speaks very quietly. This life, it says, the one you are living right now, exactly as you have lived it and are living it, you will live it again. Not a better version, not a corrected one. This same life, down to the last detail. Every joy and every shame, every loss and every wasted hour. This very night, this room, this breath you are taking now, the faint sounds in the walls, the moonlight on the floor, the demon itself murmuring these words. All of it will come back to you, in the same order, exactly an unending number of times. The hourglass of your existence will be turned over and turned over again, and you turned with it, a speck of dust, forever. And then the demon asks the only question it came to ask. Would you throw yourself down and grind your teeth and curse it? Curse the thing that has just told you that you must do every dull and aching and humiliating moment of this over again, with no end and no escape? Or is there, somewhere in your life, even a single moment, one so full and so complete that you would answer instead, yes, you are a god, and never has anything sounded more divine? Yes, let all of it come again, exactly, forever. That is what he called the heaviest weight, and it may be the strangest and most quietly devastating thing he ever set down. This was the thought that had come to him on that mountain path years before, by the great pyramid of rock, the one he could barely hold in his hands, the one he scrawled down as 6,000 feet beyond all merely human things. And notice, first, what it is not. On the surface of his published work, the eternal return is not a fact you are being asked to believe, not a claim that time is literally a circle, or that science has somehow proven the universe repeats. It is a test. It is a way of weighing a life from the inside, of discovering, in one unbearable instant, how you actually stand toward your own existence. Because the question slips straight past all the stories you tell other people and tell yourself in the daylight, and asks the single thing that cannot be faked, not whether your life looks good on paper, but whether you would take it again, all of it, without end. And here is why he called it a weight. Imagine living with that question pressing down on every hour as the measure of everything you do. Each choice you make for eternity. Choose this, and you choose it not once, but infinitely, locked into the wheel for all time. The smallest decision, to be cruel or kind, to spend this hour one way rather than another, stops being small because you are not settling it once, you are settling it forever. Most of us drift through our days as though they were rough drafts, practice rounds we will get right later, in some real life that is always just about to begin. The demon takes the drafts away. There is no later and no real life waiting in the wings. This is it, exactly this, forever. So live it, he is saying, as something you could bear to have forever. But do not let it soften into a motivational poster, because the real version is far harder and far darker than make every moment count. To say yes to the eternal return is to say yes to the whole of it. Not only the golden moments, the love and the perfect afternoons, also the worst day of your life again. The grief that nearly broke you, the things that were done to you and the things you did, all of it returning exactly, with nothing redeemed and nothing left out. Even his own prophet recoils from this. Zarathustra calls it his abysmal thought, the one he can hardly bear to look at, and what he chokes on is precisely this, that to affirm everything is to affirm the return of everything small and contemptible too, even the last man, that little blinking creature, coming back forever and ever. The test is not whether you can love the good parts. Anyone alive can manage that. The test is whether you can say yes to the whole, the parts that wrecked you included. So here, in the dark, with nowhere to be and no one watching, you can actually try it, which is something the daylight almost never permits. Take your real life, the unedited one, not the version you'd hand to a stranger. Let it run forward, the things you are proud of, and the things you would give almost anything to take back. And then ask yourself the demon's question, honestly, could you want it back? Not every part of it equally, perhaps, but enough? Is there enough yes in your life to outweigh all the no? For most people, on most nights, the honest answer is somewhere in the trembling middle. Not a curse, and not quite a hymn, but a flickering, half-willing maybe. And he would say, "Good." That maybe is exactly where the work begins. The whole purpose of the question is not to be answered once and filed away, but to become the thing you live toward, to spend a life slowly turning the maybe into a yes. Two hard problems remain, though, because honesty requires them even here. The first is the one he kept quiet about. In his private notebooks, he tried to prove the eternal return was literally true. The universe holds only so much energy and so many possible arrangements, and infinite time stretches ahead, so every arrangement, including this exact life, must come around again. He never published the proof, and that was wise because it does not actually work. Endless time and a finite world do not, in fact, guarantee that anything ever repeats precisely. As a claim about the cosmos, the eternal return is almost certainly false. As a test of the soul, its literal truth was never the point. The second problem is deeper, and it does not go away. If saying yes means craving the return of absolutely everything, then it means craving the return of every horror there has ever been, every murdered child, every atrocity brought back forever and not merely endured but loved. Is that the very summit of strength, the great yes to life, or is it a kind of moral sleep, a refusal to look straight at evil and name it, wearing the mask of wisdom? The question trails him all the way to the end. You do not have to answer the demon tonight. Let the question lie down beside you in the dark, where it can do no harm. And notice the strange thing that happens as you grow heavier and warmer and further from the day. The terrible weight of it begins somehow to soften, to feel less like a sentence and more like something you can rest beneath, the way you can rest beneath a heavy blanket. Let it carry you down rather than keep you up. Because there was a name he gave to the rare state of a person who could finally meet that demon with a clear and glad and grateful yes, to the all but impossible feat of loving your one life so completely that you would gather up every second of it and choose it again forever. It was, he believed, the very highest thing a human being could reach. And the almost unbearable part is where he found it. Not in triumph, not in happiness, but in the deepest pain and the loneliest year of his entire life. The most serene sentence he ever wrote came from one of the least serene lives anyone has ever lived. Sick and half-blind, in a cold rented room, with his skull splitting and the day ahead promising nothing but more of the same pain, he set down some of the most peaceful words in any language. I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things, he wrote. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. And then he gave the longing a name. Amor fati, amor fati, the love of fate. Let that be my love from now on. It is hard to think of a gentler wish, or a harder one. Amor fati was the answer he finally gave the demon. It is the name for the state of a person who could meet that midnight question. Would you live it all again, forever? And answer, without flinching, yes. And everything turns on the one impossible word in it, love. Not endure, not merely tolerate, love. He laid it down near the very end as his formula for human greatness, that a person should want nothing to be other than it is, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, and should not merely bear what is necessary, but should love it. To take your life, the actual one, with all its losses and failures, the things that were done to you and the things you did, and to want it, exactly this, not a single detail altered, the way you want the face of someone you love. This was, in the end, his answer to the philosophy of denial he had fallen into as a boy. Where the old master Schopenhauer had said no, turn away, want less, Nietzsche had spent his entire ruined life climbing toward a yes, and amor fati was the summit of the climb. It is desperately easy to mistake this for something it is not, and the mistake is everywhere now, dressed up in the soft language of self-help. People hear, "Love your fate," and reach for the Stoics, the ancient art of accepting what you cannot change, of detaching, of refusing to let things get to you. But amor fati is almost the reverse of that calm detachment. The Stoic tries to want less, to lower his attachment so that fate cannot wound him. He protects himself by stepping back. The man of amor fati wants more. He throws both arms around the whole of his existence, the wounds and all, and refuses to let go. It is not the cool peace of wanting nothing, but the far harder peace of wanting everything exactly as it came. And he was specific about how the thing actually works, in a way that is at once beautiful and, it turns out, dangerous. In the same breath where he names amor fati, he makes himself a vow. "I do not want to wage war against what is ugly," he writes. "I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation." The single no he will permit himself is to turn his eyes from the ugly toward the beautiful, to keep choosing, again and again, to see what is necessary as something he can love rather than something he must resent. It sounds like a kind of grace, the refusal to pour your one short life out into bitterness and blame. And for a private soul learning to carry its own suffering, it may be exactly that. You almost certainly have something in your own life that fits the test. A loss you cannot undo, or a choice you would give anything to take back, or a stretch of years you would erase if it were yours to erase. The ordinary sane response to such a thing is obvious. Of course you would undo it. Who on earth wouldn't? What he is asking is nearly too much. He is asking whether you could ever arrive. Not by pretending it never hurt, nor by deciding it was secretly good all along, but by some deeper and stranger turn, at a place where you could look at even that, the very worst of it, and find yourself able to say yes to it, that it belongs, that it made you what you are, that you would not, in the end, give it back, because giving it back would mean giving back the whole of who you have become. Most of us cannot do that, not honestly, not for the worst things, but you have likely felt the edge of it, that quiet moment, years after some wound, when you notice that you would not actually trade it away, because the person it shaped is the person you now are. That small, hard-won reconciliation, made total, made into an entire way of living, is what he was reaching for. But now the strongest blow against the whole luminous idea, and he is not rescued from it. The philosopher Philippa Foot pressed on it hardest. Amor fati, carried all the way to its limit, means loving everything that is necessary, refusing to accuse, refusing to make war on the ugly, saying yes to all of it. But all of it includes the genuinely monstrous. It includes the murdered and the tortured, the great horrors of history. Taken to the end, amor fati seems to demand not merely that you make peace with your own private griefs, but that you embrace, actively love, welcome, will the eternal return of every atrocity that has ever happened. And that is not wisdom. That may be a kind of moral disaster. The right response to a child being tortured is not to love it as one necessary thread in the beautiful weave of being, but to say no, fiercely with your whole body, to refuse it, to fight it, to accuse. A philosophy whose highest virtue forbids you that no has let go of something essential to being a decent human being. And Nietzsche's lovely vow of looking away begins to seem less like grace and more like a man patiently training himself not to see. There is a quieter version of the doubt, too, more personal, the one that has been waiting since the lonely mountain years. Remember who is writing these words about loving your fate. A man sick on nearly every day of his adult life, alone, refused, betrayed by the people closest to him. with no wife and no readers, no home and no health, almost nothing that any of us would call a good fate at all. When a man like that says, with his whole heart, that he loves his life and would take every second of it again forever, is that the highest wisdom a human being has ever reached? The victory of a soul that went all the way to the bottom and came back able to bless even its own ruin? Or is it something gentler and far sadder, the most beautiful story a desperately suffering man ever told himself, the one story that would let him keep going, keep working, in a life that had handed him almost no other reason to? You cannot tell from the outside. It is quite possible he could not tell from the inside. And yet here is the thing to sit with, the thing that makes him so hard to wave away. Even if it was a story he told himself, perhaps especially if it was, there is something close to unbearable in the courage of it. A man with every reason in the world to curse his existence chose instead to spend the last of his strength learning how to love it. Whether that was the truth about life or only the truth he needed in order to survive, he reached it, and he reached it from a depth of pain that would have crushed most of us into the smallest and most bitter version of ourselves. There may simply be no harder thing a person can do than to be handed a life like his and answer it anyway with a yes. Your own life, loved or not yet loved, can be set down now for the night. You do not have to forgive any of it tonight, or bless it, or decide one way or the other. The question of yes and no will keep, and the body that has carried you through all of it can finally let its weight go and rest. He had climbed the highest peak he would ever reach, the great impossible yes to everything. And then, only a few short months after he found it, the silence came for him. The mind that had just taught the world how to love its fate was about to go dark, all the way dark, and it would never come back. On the morning of the 3rd of January, 1889, in a public square in the Italian city of Turin, Friedrich Nietzsche's mind broke. The story everyone tells about how it happened goes like this. He stepped out of his lodgings and saw across the square a cab driver beating his horse, whipping the exhausted animal as it refused to move. And something in Nietzsche, the great philosopher of hardness and strength, simply gave way. He ran across the cobblestones, flung his arms around the horse's neck to shield it from the blows, and collapsed there in the street, sobbing, and was never sane again. It is a perfect and terrible little story, the prophet of pitilessness undone, at the last, by pity for a beaten animal. And it is almost certainly not true, at least not in that form. The trouble is that the horse cannot be traced to anyone who was actually there. It surfaces only decades afterward, third hand, passed along by people who witnessed nothing, and the vivid detail of the flogging seems to have grown in the retelling, like a fish that gets larger with each man who tells it. Part of why it took such deep root is that it reads like a scene torn straight out of Dostoevsky, a writer Nietzsche revered, and there is in fact a scene almost exactly like it in Crime and Punishment, a man dreaming of a mare being beaten to death in the road. So the single most famous moment of his life may be half borrowed from a novel. What can be said for certain is plainer and no gentler. In the first days of that January, in Turin, his mind came apart, and it never healed. What we have in place of the horse are the letters. In those first cracked days, before anyone could reach him, he sat in his room and dashed off a flurry of short, wild notes to people scattered across Europe, and they are among the most haunting things in the whole history of the human mind. He had stopped signing his own name. He signed them instead as Dionysus, the god of intoxication and dissolution he had invoked his entire life, and as the Crucified. To an old colleague from his Basel days, a great historian, he wrote a sentence almost unbearable in its lucid madness, that in the end he would far rather be a Basel professor than God, but that he had not dared to push his private selfishness so far as to give up creating the world on its account. And to the widow of the composer he had once half-worshipped from across a room, he sent only 3 words: Ariadne, Ariadne, I love you. The genius was still flickering somewhere in the wreckage, strange and broken-hearted, and then it guttered out. Word reached his oldest friends. One of them, a loyal man named Overbeck, who had stood by him faithfully for 20 years, dropped everything and took the train south. He found Nietzsche collapsed against the piano in his rented room, pounding the keys with his elbows, singing and shouting. Gently, he got him onto a train and brought him home, and that long journey was the end of Nietzsche's life as a thinking, speaking man. He was not yet 45. They placed him in an asylum, first in Basel and then in another, and the doctors examined him and reached for the obvious answer of their age. Tertiary syphilis, they said. The slow rot of the brain that ended so many men in that century, traced back from some old infection of his youth to the ruin in front of them. For 100 years afterward, that was the settled verdict, but it has quietly come apart. He survived in the dark for 11 years, and that kind of syphilis usually kills a man within 2 or 3. He was missing the textbook signs the disease leaves behind. The honest truth is that no one knows what destroyed his mind. It might have been syphilis after all. It might just as easily have been a slow tumour pressing behind the eyes that had been failing him his whole life, or the same hereditary darkness that had carried off his father, the gentle country pastor, at 35, the softening of the brain that the doctors of that earlier generation could not name either. Father and son, a generation apart, both minds going out from something nobody could read, and here is the cruelest turn of all. In the last sane year of his life, the recognition he had ached for across 2 decades of being ignored had finally, just barely, begun. A Danish critic had started lecturing on his philosophy to crowded halls. Word was spreading through Europe. The great unread man was, at long last, about to be read. He learned of it only months before the collapse, the first faint warmth of a fame that was about to become enormous. And then the lights went out. The fame he had wanted his whole life arrived and swelled into something vast, over a man who could no longer understand a single word of it, sitting silent in a shuttered room. In those final lucid months, he had written a strange, soaring, half-mad little book about himself, in which he called himself Dynamite and foretold, with an eerie calm, that his name would one day be tied to something monstrous. He was right, and he would not be there to see it, or to lift a finger to stop it. What followed was 11 years of silence. His mother took him home and cared for him like a small child. He sat for long hours, mute or murmuring, now and then picking out a few notes on a piano, now and then speaking a fragment that almost sounded like sense before it dissolved into nothing. The fierce electric mind that had taken apart God and good and evil, that had taught the world to overcome itself and to love its own fate. It was simply gone, and what was left was a vacant, gentle man who had to be dressed and fed and led from room to room. And here is the unbearable irony that sits at the very centre of his story, the thing that turns the rest of it black. The man who had made self-creation the highest of all human tasks, who said you must become who you are, author your own values, never let a single self be handed to you by anyone. That man was now, for the last 11 years of his life, and for all the years after, completely unable to speak for himself. He had become a blank page, and a blank page, in the wrong hands, can be made to say absolutely anything. If you have ever sat beside someone whose mind was leaving them, a parent, a grandparent, slipping off somewhere you could not follow, still breathing and still warm, but no longer entirely there, then you know a little of what those long years were, the terrible patience they demand, the way a person can be present and absent in the very same moment, and try, if you can stand to picture being the one it is happening to, the last clear days when some part of you can feel the dark gathering at the edges and cannot push it back, knowing, perhaps, that everything you ever were is about to be taken, and that you will be left stranded inside your own silent body while the world goes on and does with your name whatever it pleases. The silence that swallowed him can be, just for tonight, a kind of mercy you are allowed to borrow. The deep quiet of your own dark room, where nothing is being asked of you and nothing needs to be said or solved. Let the day fall silent too, and rest in it, because he was carried at the very end to a town called Weimar, to a house on a hill, and placed into the care of the one person who had been waiting patiently all along for exactly this. Waiting for the day the brother who had seen straight through her would finally fall silent, and his name and his words and the whole of his enormous unfinished work would be left helpless and unguarded entirely in her hands. Upstairs in the great house at Weimar, a man sits in a white robe by a window, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes open and empty. From time to time his sister brings a visitor up to look at him, an admirer or a curious journalist, and they stand in the doorway and gaze at the great philosopher in his silence, the way you might gaze at a saint's bones behind glass. One cultured guest of the age wrote afterward that Nietzsche, sitting there, resembled not someone sick or mad so much as a dead man. He was, in every way that counted, already a corpse. And downstairs, his sister had begun to build a religion around him. Her name was Elizabeth, and to understand the betrayal, you need two facts about her. The first is that she was a passionate anti-Semite and German nationalist. She had married an anti-Semitic agitator and gone off with him into the jungles of Paraguay to found a colony of pure-blooded Germans, a venture that failed and ended in his suicide. The second is that her brother had despised every part of it. He had broken with her over precisely this, over her hatreds and her husband, and in the savage little autobiography he wrote at the very end, the one called Ecce Homo. Behold the man. He had named his own mother and his sister as the deepest contradiction of everything he was, the two people on earth most opposed to him. She would make certain the particular book stayed locked away for nearly 20 years. With her brother silent and helpless, Elizabeth moved with an extraordinary, patient will. She seized control of his estate and his manuscripts, fighting even her own mother for them, and installed everything in the grand villa as a shrine, with herself as its high priestess and him as its sacred relic. She dressed him in those flowing white robes and granted carefully chosen pilgrims an audience with the silent oracle. She had a heroic marble bust carved of him, quietly improving on his actual features. A journalist was even allowed in to watch him sleep. The man who had warned the world against every herd and every priest had become the centerpiece of a cult, run by the very person he had named as his opposite. Then she went to work on the words. The most consequential thing she ever did was to manufacture a book. Among his papers were thousands of notebook fragments, discarded thoughts and abandoned drafts, things he had deliberately set aside. Years earlier, he had toyed with writing a great work to be called The Will to Power, and had then dropped the plan completely and used the material elsewhere. Elizabeth and an assistant took those leftover scraps, chose the ones she liked, and arranged them into an order he had never chosen, built around an outline he himself had thrown in the bin, and published the result as his crowning masterwork, his final system, the secret key to all the rest. The fragments were genuinely his. The book was not. Decades later, when scholars finally went back to the original manuscripts, they reached a flat verdict. The book, as a book, does not exist. She did not stop there either. She forged perhaps 30 letters, sometimes crudely, dropping ink on the word mother, so that affectionate notes he had sent their mother could be passed off as letters to herself, and slowly, across years, she edited her dead brother into a more German, more nationalist man, stripped of his contempt for the very things she loved. So that when a movement rose up in Germany, hungry for exactly such a prophet, she was ready and waiting. She courted the new fascists. She exchanged warm letters with Mussolini. She welcomed Hitler to her archive more than once and pressed into his hands, as a gift, her brother's own walking stick. In fact, a sword stick, a gentleman's cane with a blade concealed inside it. There is a famous photograph from those years. Hitler standing in the archive, gazing up at the heroic marble bust, an image put about to suggest a torch being passed. The regime sent her money. When she died, in the 1930s, Hitler himself attended the funeral, and she was laid to rest as the priestess of an eternal Germany. By then the work was finished. The man was now, officially, a philosopher of the Reich. To feel how grotesque that is, set it beside what the living man had actually written in his own hand while sane. He had called the worshipped nation-state the coldest of all cold monsters. He had poured scorn on German nationalism and on the herd. He had broken with his closest friend partly over anti-Semitism, and had written to an anti-Semitic publisher to ask, witheringly, how he was supposed to feel about his Zarathustra being mouthed by Jew haters, demanding to be kept absolutely clean of the whole movement. In one of his last cracked notes from Turin, he scrawled that he wanted every anti-Semite shot. This is the man they remade into the philosopher of the master race. The inversion was not partial, it was total. The careful construction of a prophet who taught the exact opposite of what the living man had screamed. It took a long time and patient work to undo. After the war, with the Nazi Nietzsche poisoning his whole name, scholars set themselves to separating the forgeries from the real text, printing the notebook fragments back in their true order, so the fake book simply dissolved, exposing the doctored letters, prying the actual philosopher out of the priestess's hands. One American scholar, Walter Kaufmann, did more than anyone to give the English-speaking world back a Nietzsche worth reading. The rescue largely worked. But, and this matters, it may have swung too far the other way. In their hurry to save him from the Nazis, some of his rescuers sanded him down into a gentle, almost harmless liberal humanist, which he also was not. And that brings us to the hardest thing in his entire story, the thing the comforting version, wicked sister, innocent genius, will not let you say. The forgery is real. The Nazi reading is a grotesque distortion, but the forgery only explains the swastika on the cover. It does not explain the hardness inside. Because if you set Elizabeth completely aside, and read only the books he wrote and published and stood fully behind while sane, you find, in his own clear voice, things that are genuinely hard to stomach, an order of rank among human beings, a cold contempt for pity as a kind of sickness, the flat claim that a healthy society must accept the sacrifice of countless ordinary people, reduced to instruments, so that a few great ones can rise. The weak and the failures shall perish, he wrote, sane in his own hand, and one should even help them to it. None of that is his sister's invention. The Nazis did not have to forge those pages, they only had to read them and look away from everything standing around them. We do not get to lay all of it at Elizabeth's door. Some of the darkness was already in the man, and any honest reckoning with him has to hold the forgery and the real hardness in the same hand at the same time, without letting go of either. Stand for a moment in that archive, the silent man upstairs, the manufactured book in its glass case, the photograph of the dictator at the bust, and feel the weight of the question it leaves in your hands. What do you do with a mind like this? One that gave you the death of God and the love of fate, real gifts that have genuinely helped people live, and that also gave you, in the very same voice, lines that helped lay paving stones on a road to atrocity. Both easy answers fail. You cannot simply embrace him and pretend the dark passages are not there, and you cannot simply throw him away and pretend the gifts are not real. He forces the harder thing, to read with your eyes open, taking what is true and life-giving, naming what is dangerous as exactly that, and refusing the comfort of a clean verdict in either direction. Which may, in the end, be the only honest way to honor a man who spent his whole life tearing the comforting verdicts off of everything else. This is heavy history, and it does not need carrying down into sleep with you. Set it at the door. In the morning it will still be true and still complicated, and you will be far better able to hold both halves of it then. For now, leave the archive and the forgeries and the long, bitter argument behind, and come back one last time to the man himself. Not the prophet they built, not the monster they made of him, but the actual human being underneath it all, a half-blind, suffering man, almost entirely alone, who somehow loved his terrible life and would have lived every hour of it again. He is owed, at the very least, one honest question before we finally let him rest. So come back to him then, one last time, and let the whole of what we have met tonight gather quietly together before we set it down for good. It has been a long way to travel with one man, from a small boy standing at the edge of his father's deathbed to a vacant figure in a white robe propped by a window, with all the dazzling and dangerous distance in between. And somewhere across that distance, you have met not just the events of a life, but the whole shape of a mind. It is worth holding it all in view for a moment, the way you might stand back at the end and look at a single, enormous painting you have been examining one corner at a time. Here in the end is who he was, a pastor's son who lost his God as a young man, and then spent every remaining year of his life trying to find what on earth could stand in the place where God had stood. A sick, lonely, half-blind man who walked the high mountains alone, vomiting and aching, and built out of that almost unlivable life the most life-loving philosophy the modern world has produced. He saw, long before almost anyone else, that the floor was quietly dropping out of the Western world, that the old certainties had stopped being true and no one had yet noticed the fall, and he spent his strength trying to warn us. And then, in the cruelest joke his story has to offer, the people who seized his name after he could no longer speak turned him into a banner for the very thing he had spent his life warning against. Which brings us, at last, to the question we have been circling since the very first words tonight. What, in the end, was he trying to warn us about? It comes down to something quite simple and quite frightening. When the old certainties die, when God, or whatever it is that has been holding your particular world together, finally goes silent, the empty place left behind does not stay empty. Something always rushes in to fill it, and he saw with terrible clarity the three things that would. Some people, he thought, would simply sink into the grey suspicion that nothing matters at all, and call that grim suspicion the truth. Far more would shrink down into the small, warm, blinking comfort he so dreaded, the comfort of wanting nothing larger ever again, of a life made entirely of mild pleasures and managed risks, and the most desperate would hand themselves over, body and soul, to some new idol, a flag, a leader, a cause loud enough to drown out the silence, and call that surrender meaning. He feared all three, and the third most savagely of all. And the bitterest irony of his afterlife is that the people who carried off his name marched straight down that third road and nailed his stolen words above it. He believed there was a fourth road, only one, and it was the hardest thing he ever asked of another human being. After the old meanings die, he said, you do not get to inherit a new one ready-made. You have to make it yourself, by hand, out of your own single life, with no God looking over your shoulder and no crowd to disappear into, and no guarantee anywhere that you have got it right. You have to make your own values, become the person you actually are underneath all the borrowed ones, and learn somehow to love the fate that made you. And you have to do most of it, he thought, alone. It is a brutal thing to ask of anyone. It was also, to his mind, the only honest thing left to ask in a world where the comfortable old answers had quietly stopped being true. And almost no one takes that road, because almost no one can bear the weight of it. And so we arrive at the one honest question we truly owe him, the one that cannot be answered from where any of us is standing, the one to carry down with you into the dark tonight. He taught the love of fate, that a person should want their life exactly as it is, the suffering and the failure folded right in, and should be able to will the whole of it back again, every second, forever. He called that the very highest thing a human being can reach. And he reached it, or swore that he did, out of a sick and lonely and almost entirely unread life that had refused him nearly everything a person wants. So which was it really? Was that enormous yes the genuine summit of the human spirit? The hardest and truest thing a soul can possibly do? To look at a life like his, or like anyone's, with all its losses laid bare, and bless it anyway? Or was it the most beautiful story a desperately suffering man ever told himself, the single lie lovely enough to let him keep getting up and walking? You cannot settle it from here. He could not settle it from the inside. And it matters more than it might seem, because in the end it is not really a question about him at all. It is a question about you. There is one crack beneath even that, worth feeling just once before you sleep, because he never managed to close it. He told you to become who you are, to be the author of your own self, your own values, your own life. And yet he also said, just as fiercely, that there is no you behind your actions at all. No captain at the wheel, no little self pulling the strings, only the drives and the body and the dealt fate doing what they were always going to do. So who exactly is being ordered to become who they are? Who is left to do the choosing if there is no one at home behind the deed? He handed the world a magnificent command, and may never quite have noticed that he left no one standing there to obey it. It is the deepest fault line running under his whole cathedral, and he went dark before he could ever mend it, and so it sits there still, cracked open, left to us, like so much of what he started and could not finish. And here, at the very end, you can set the long arguments down and simply be tender with him, because he has surely earned that much. Picture him one final time, not as the prophet they built, and not as the monster they made him into, but only as the man he actually was, half blind, walking alone in the thin mountain air, with his skull splitting, scribbling hymns to joy that not one soul would read while he lived. A man who wrote more achingly about love than almost anyone who has ever held a pen, and was, in his own life, loved by almost no one, who built an entire philosophy of yes out of a life that handed him every reason in the world for no. He was right at the last about the two things he foretold, that he was a kind of dynamite and that his name would one day be bound up with something monstrous. He lit the fuse, and then he was gone, silent in a chair in an upstairs room, long before it went off, with no way left to stand up and say that this was never what he had meant. There is something almost unbearable in that, and something in it, too, that asks for our tenderness far more than it asks for our verdict. So let it come home now, softly to you, here in the dark, with the whole of the day finally behind you. Because the demon's question, the one that came in the night and asked whether you would live it all again, that was never really about him. It was always, quietly, about you and about your own one life. This one, the only one you will be given, the one you are living at this very moment, in this room, on this particular night that will never come back around again. You do not have to answer the demon tonight. You do not have to decide whether you could take the whole of it again, exactly, without end. But you might let the question lie down here beside you, soft and unhurried, and notice, gently, without forcing anything at all, whether there is, somewhere in your own strange and difficult life, even a single hour you would not give back. That is where he would have had you begin. Not with the whole of it, just with 1 hour worth the keeping. And now there is nothing left that needs thinking about. You have met the whole of him tonight, the grieving boy and the lonely wanderer, the dangerous mind and the gentle ruin it became, the great gift and the great warning, and the long, long silence at the end of it. It is all here, and all of it can rest now, and so can you. Let the questions go loose in your hands. They are old questions, far older than you, and they will keep perfectly well until the morning, or until some other night, or until never at all, and it truly does not matter which. Let the weight of the day, and the weight of the heaviest thought he ever had, settle slowly down through you and out into the dark, where it can do you no harm. Your breathing has been slowing for a while now, all on its own, and you do not have to do a single thing to help it. The room is exactly as it was when we began, and it will hold you through the night. Somewhere 100 years and more behind us, a man with almost nothing decided that a life like his, a life like anyone's, a life like yours, was worth saying yes to, even so, even all of it. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was only brave. Tonight you do not have to choose between them. Tonight there is nothing at all to choose, and nowhere you need to be, and no one anywhere asking a single thing of you. Let him rest now, at last. He earned it the hardest way there is. And let yourself rest along with him. Your one unrepeatable life, and whatever you decide to make of it, will still be here in the morning, patient and waiting. But not now. Now there is only the dark, and your own slow breath, and the simple, ordinary mercy of being allowed finally to let go. Rest now. Sleep well. Good night.